Hey now, and welcome back to the DrupalEasy podcast, and welcome to Season 17, Episode number 2. In today's episode, I'll be talking with Janez from Tag1 Consulting. I will let him pronounce his own last name as we talk about Gander, the open-source automated performance testing framework for Drupal. This episode is sponsored by Drupal Career Online, DrupalEasy's world-class, best practice-focused, long-form Drupal training course for beginners. If you or someone you know is looking to professionalize their Drupal skills, definitely check it out at drupaleasy.com/DCO. The next semester begins September 4th. Welcome, Janez, to the DrupalEasy podcast. We were just joking a second ago that I am not even going to attempt to say your last name, so go ahead and introduce yourself real quick.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Janez Urevc, and I'm also known as /RSM on Drupal.org.
Oh, thank you. I was gonna introduce you by your Drupal.org username as well. So you've been knocking around the Drupal community for about as long as I have, about 15 years.
Yeah, it feels like.
You're currently the Strategic Growth and Innovation Manager at Tag1 Consulting. So how did you get into Drupal? What have you been doing for the past 15 years?
Yeah, I got into Drupal because when I was still a student, I was talking to the head of our local student organization, and he was asking me if I know anyone that builds websites. And I didn't, but I was studying computer science, and I said, sure, yeah, I can do it for you. And then that didn't happen. But then a few months later, another friend calls me and he's like, oh, Rock told me that you're building websites and I'm now working for this tennis tournament and we need a website. Would you build it? And I was like, yeah, sure. And then when we signed the contract, I had to figure out how to do it.
So what technology did you ultimately use? Did you go right to Drupal or did you build that first?
That's I teamed up with another friend and we went with Drupal. And I've been doing this pretty much ever since. First, this was more like a hobby or a side thing, and then it grew up into a full career. And then I worked for the biggest Slovenian daily newspaper, where we built a few of their websites on Drupal. It was Drupal 7 at the time. And after that, I joined Examiner.com, which used to be the largest Drupal website on the internet back then. And they also launched when it was on Drupal 7, and they launched when Drupal 7 was still in alpha, I believe. I joined later, but they were really early with Drupal 7.
So where along that journey does the kind of performance optimization stuff come in for you?
I've always been interested in performance, and even at the Slovenian publishing company, I've did quite some performance optimizations because they were quite sensitive about performance. And then, especially after joining Examiner, like with such a scale as Examiner was, performance was like the first-class citizen on a daily basis. That's where it really started.
We're going to talk about Gander here in a minute or so, which is kind of automated performance testing. Is that a good way of?
Yeah, we call it automated performance testing for Drupal. Open source automated performance testing for Drupal.
Right. Okay. So what did folks use? What did you use and other folks in your position use to measure performance for Drupal sites before Gander? Like what were the common tools 5-10 years ago?
It was pretty much, I think, done manually for the most part. Like
definitely not automated.
Definitely not automated. Like sometimes we would use profilers where you would get certain numbers out, or things like the val module would give you some stats. And maybe like you could use inspector or developer tools in your browser to get some metrics, but it was all pretty much manual.
All right, so let's talk about Gander, or let's kind of get into it a little bit. Before we do, I do want to mention for folks who have never heard of Gander or maybe have just heard it in passing, what makes Gander pretty cool, in my opinion, is that it's in order to write a performance test, it's not all that different from writing any other functional JavaScript PHP unit class.
Correct.
Or PHP unit test. There are base classes specific to performance testing that are in Drupal core since what
10.2.
10.2. Thank you. I think are they actually called performance testing, or haven't they? Oh, performance data. There's a base class called performance data.
The performance data, now we're getting technical, but performance data class is where the data gets collected, and the base class for the test is called performance test base.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to mention that up front because I kind of wanted to take the mystery out of, like, how do you do any of this stuff? And for folks who already know how to write, PHP unit tests, especially functional JavaScript tests, this is not that big of a leap from there.
Exactly. And also, infrastructure-wise, as we will discuss later, there are two ways that are complementary on how you can use these performance tests, but especially the first simpler way of using it doesn't even require any other infrastructure. So if you already have your infrastructure to run JavaScript functional tests, whether it's GitHub Actions or GitLab CI or whatever it may be, it will already be able to run performance tests as well.
Right. And I think that's one of the really cool things about Gander, in my opinion, is the fact that most people who already are writing functional JavaScript tests probably already know, 90% of what they need to know in order to write a performance test. Is that fair, you think?
Yeah, that's completely correct.
All right. Now that we've kind of set the table for that, why Gander? What was the genesis for the idea? Were there any other options on the table as far as implementing, an automated performance testing framework for Drupal? So kind of take us through the genesis.
Yeah, so it all started about 2 years ago when we were introduced to Google Chrome team, and one of their goals is to help make internet faster, which is a very mundane goal, right? But they understood very quickly that the biggest bang for the buck will be if they will collaborate with big frameworks, big like CMSs that run the internet. The most obvious thought would be WordPress, which they also work with, and they are also building their performance testing framework, and we are collaborating. And then they also identified Drupal as a major CMS. And they approached us, and we started exploring how we could collaborate. And in the first round, we added lazy loading of images and media embeds into Drupal core. That was added in 9.5 and then some things in 10. So now you have lazy loading of images by default in core. This is directly came out of this collaboration between Tag1 and Google Chrome team. And then after achieving that, we put a few more ideas to the table and we brainstormed what could be next steps that we could do. And we identified automated performance testing as something that could have really big impact long term. We understood that the investment would be larger than just like improving image formatters, and it would take longer time to see the results. But it's also, it was identified as something that is quite innovative and also could have a really big impact long term. So that's how the idea about Gander started. And on the other hand, one of the performance engineers and also core subsystem maintainer, Nathaniel Catch, opened an issue in Drupal core's issue queue 15 years ago, proposing the idea of adding automated performance testing to Drupal. And now we finally were able to revive this issue, and it was also Catch who led the development and designed the architecture of Gander. So it all finally came together after 15 years.
That's amazing. I was going to ask you, I shared a rundown with Janez prior to the recording. I was going to ask you why automated performance testing, but I'm not even sure we need to answer that question. I think it's probably pretty obvious why automated performance testing is better than kind of one-offs here and there. It's all about the historical data that you can collect and watch over time. Is there any other reasons? I mean, non-obvious reasons, let's say?
It also brings standardization to the table. Performance testing is first, before Gander, it was done just occasionally, but every tester was using some other way of testing, like some slightly different steps slightly different configuration, whatever it may be. So the results were never really reliable. And now we have standardized tests that always run with the same environment, and this brings reliable results to the table.
Apples to apples, oranges to oranges
Exactly,
type
yeah.
situation.
And I like to say we introduced automated testing to Drupal. I don't even remember how long ago, but it's probably way more than a decade now, I think. Imagine developing Drupal without automated tests in 2024.
It would be a different product.
Yeah. And I think that we will come to a similar point with automated testing, especially because we already have a testing culture in the community.
All right, so let's take a step back because I'm just thinking about something here. So if these base classes are already in Drupal core and they've been there for quite some time, what is Gander in that case? And like what actually physically is not physically, but file wise or tool wise, when someone says we're using Gander, I mean that's more than just the base classes, correct?
Yes. Obviously, base classes are a very important part of Gander. But then later, when we will be discussing about two ways of using Gander, the more advanced way is to regularly run tests, collect data, and then send this data to a dashboard where you can create graphs and compare different branches and over time. And this ideally would let you spot any anomalies. Like if you committed something that really slowed down a part that is being tested, you should see it on the graph. And to do that side of things, we use OpenTelemetry, and then you could wire any dashboard that speaks to OpenTelemetry into this picture. We are using Grafana, and we at Tag1 are also hosting Grafana for Drupal core, which is at grafana.tag1.io.
I'll have that link in the show notes for everybody as well.
So part of Gander is also like default configuration for Grafana, default graph configurations. All that is open source. All that is on GitHub. So if you want to start running tests and doing this longer term monitoring, you can use the configuration that is already provided as a starting point, or just use it as is. Then Gander is also, we have a DDev add-on that lets you spin the environment to do this with Grafana and everything locally. So it's not just base class. Base class is the central part of it all, but there are other things around it that complement it, that make it possible to do what we're doing, and we try to make it as easy as possible for people to start. And at the end of the day, Gander sounds way better than saying open source automated performance testing framework for Drupal over and over again. I think that like naming and marketing, if you will, is important, and having a concise short name for something is beneficial.
So this is one of the things that confused me, and still does, because I haven't actually written a Gander test at this point. Without using the DDev add-on, any of the Grafana stuff, you can still write tests, as we talked about, using those base classes.
Yes.
When you do that, and obviously you're not getting the data over time, you're just kind of getting a snapshot. But how do you actually get access to that data? How does that data surface itself?
When you're writing a test, you decide which part of your testing procedure you want to collect performance metrics for. Because there can be steps in your test procedure that are preparation steps, and you don't want to measure performance data on those steps. So for example,
if you're setting up content types and all that stuff in your setup method.
Exactly. If you're trying to warm up caches, for example, so if you have a test that should run with warm caches, you do some steps before to warm up caches. And then at the point when you're ready, you put your test steps that you want to measure performance data for into a closure. And then after those steps have run, you get back this performance data object that you mentioned earlier. And there you have all the performance data that was collected during those steps. And then you can start checking if the numbers that are coming back are the numbers that you're expecting. There are some metrics that are deterministic, that are great for assertions. So for one example would be number of database queries. In a standardized environment, it never changes. Unless you change something in the code, the number of database queries shouldn't change. And you can check that. Like you can do your steps and say, okay, I expect this number of database queries to fire during this steps that I've just taken. And if that changes, your test can fail. And this is what we call performance assertions. And another example of deterministic metric would be number and type of cache requests. If you have a page with hot caches and you're not changing anything, you wouldn't expect any cache invalidations. You wouldn't expect any cache sets to happen. You would only expect cache gets to happen on that page. So this is something that you could test as well. And then we also have some, I like to call them non-deterministic metrics that will always vary a little bit. We have a few core vitals in there. We didn't speak about core web vitals, but these are the main metric that Google Chrome team uses. So that's why it is important for us and them to be added. But it's also great because it gives you an accurate picture of back-end and front-end performance. So we are doing those. We also have time to first byte, for example. And this kind of metrics, no matter how much standardized your environment is, will always vary a little bit. So it's harder to assert on those. Like if one time you have time to first byte of 315 milliseconds, it could be 320 the next time. So it's hard to assert on a specific number. So we generally recommend to do not use those for assertions, to use the ones that are more deterministic. But if you really wanted to, you could probably assert on a range. It could still produce false negatives or false positives. But if you tweak the range, depending on the environment where you are running this, then you might be okay doing that. But just be aware.
I'm so glad you answered the question that way, because I was 85% sure that that was the answer based on like the blog posts and stuff that I read. So I really appreciate you answering the question that way. And just to summarize, so the deterministic values like number of queries and cache sets and cache gets, good for assertions. The non-deterministic values are good for kind of the long-term monitoring. And
Yes.
that's where Grafana comes in. So
yes,
fantastic. All right. So going back to the deterministic values, the assertions, there's some great code samples. We'll have some links in the show notes as far as getting started with Grafana, with Gander, and just some real like 10, 12 line code samples that are just really easy to understand, super clear. And with assertions for a query count or a cache set or cache get counts. So my question is, like, when writing the test, how do you know what the right answer should be? Like, how do you know when you're writing that assertion saying, the query count should be 12, like, where do I go to determine that, it should be 12, like 12 is the right answer? So I think for me, that's the missing piece of the process when writing these tests.
It really depends.
Oh, that's the worst way to start off an answer.
Okay. I think that if you are writing a test to cover some functionality, and it's not about covering a regression that you just fixed, you would generally, I think, write a test and see what the result is in the test, and then just put that number in. And then as you are developing your project module, your custom site, whatever it is, your test will fail if this number will change, obviously. And then you go in and check what changed. And then you decide whether this change was desirable or not. And then you change the expected numbers based on that. And this is exactly what we've seen happening in Drupal core issue queue. When people are writing tests, they write them to pass with the current numbers. And then there was another issue that was touching something that touched some queries. and they increased the number of queries, and the test failed on that issue. And the person that was working on that other issue was not even aware of Gander, and that's how they learned about it. And then it's up to you to decide whether the change was something that you wanted or something that was a potential regression. So yeah, I think that that's the answer. You just write a test and see what numbers come out, and then continue from there.
So it sounds like that using Gander for performance testing, it's really all about changes, regardless of if you're using something like Grafana to looking at changes over long periods of time. But if you're not collecting all that data, just by nature of the way the assertions are written, right? Like this bit of code should have X number of queries. You're looking for, if that test fails, that means that number of queries has changed from the previous version of the code. So it's kind of like over time with two data points, before and after type of situation. So I think it's kind of important to note that this isn't a tool to figure out the why something bad is happening performance wise. It's just more of a tool to recognize, hey, something has changed and it's probably not good. Is that a good way of looking at it?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It definitely won't tell you what is wrong.
Right. It's not going to tell you that you've got some block that has a max age of 0 or something. That's.
Yeah. Like, of course, no, it won't. It won't point you to that specific block.
Right.
But if you are testing the page where this block appears, and then like having this block at max age 0 would probably change something in the queries that are being run or in the cache requests that are being issued. So then you would see that something off is going on. And to your point, we at Tag1 also do a lot of projects called performance audits, where clients that have performance issues come to us and ask us to look into why the performance problems are happening and to provide recommendations. And we see the same type of problems almost on every audit that we do. And the two biggest ones are cache misuse and views misuse. And I've been banging my head to the wall for the last 2+ years. And I was trying to come up with a solution to fix that, because if something is appearing over and over again, then it's probably a systemic problem. And nothing has been done on that front yet, but I was thinking like maybe we could have default or like helper tests for Gander that would just make sure that on a page with hot caches, you are not doing anything like you mentioned, having a max age 0 or, doing invalidations on every page load or something like that. But then again, people would need to know that this is a problem and they would need to use it, this like test that we could provide. And it could be very simple. Like it could be a test where you just provide a list of pages and then test figures out how to make the caches hot and check for these things. I think it would be possible to do it generally with not a lot of setup for the end user, but you would still need to know that it exists and to be actively using it to benefit from it. It's not, because I was even thinking like maybe there is better understanding of cache system, and I was thinking about doing like a course about it or a series of videos trying to teach people how caching works in Drupal 8, 9, 10. But it's not that these resources are not out there. There are plenty of blog posts, plenty of sessions from DrupalCons that are recorded where this all is explained. So I'm not really sure how to approach this to really make an impact.
I almost appreciate the segue because I do, as part of our long form module development course, I spend 2 to 3 weeks on caching towards the end of the course. And it turns out to be not only difficult to learn, but also difficult to teach. And from what I see, what happens more often than not is you learn a little bit about caching, enough to be dangerous, so to speak, and then you're working on a project and there is a performance issue that's related to caching. And again, in my experience, I see most of the time the solution is not as nuanced as it should be. The solution is that thing's the problem. We got to cache the heck out of that thing. And then it's, either it's over cached or caching is completely turned off, right? It's almost binary at that point rather than, a more nuanced approach to set that caching somewhere with cache tags somewhere intelligently where the data stays fresh, but it still has some level of caching. It's not, it is not an easy thing to teach or learn. I'm kind of at the point where I catch myself saying a lot of this comes down to experience, right? I can teach you the tools, the concepts, how to turn the levers and dials, but you have to have some experience of turning those levers and dials to really get a feel for it.
And also thirst for knowledge. I think that in our industry, it's really important to be constantly learning. And this is one of those things where this becomes really important. So if you are working on your project yourself, then this is very important. If you're looking for service providers that will build something for you, then it's really important to find people that really understand what they're doing. Because if a lot of these problems can be below the radar for a very long time. And if performance is neglected long enough, it becomes so intertwined into the project that it becomes really hard to fix.
Or it could just be written off as our server slow, right?
Yeah.
As opposed,
But if the server is slow, then you can solve this by throwing more muscle at the side.
Well, I'm not saying that's always accurate, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these performance problems that are really impactful are not linear type of problems, are exponential. And with this kind of problems, you won't solve it by throwing more hardware at it.
Right. All right. I want to take a step sideways, maybe. I want to go back to the long-term kind of data collection, seeing the trends over time, Grafana and the other tools. So for someone to take advantage of that, that's going to require a server with the right software that the performance tests are actually sending data to, and that data is stored. So that's where an additional cost is going to come in, or you could self-host it somewhere, or as you mentioned, there's a DDEV add-on, so you can kind of see that on your local on DDEV where it's useful but not that useful. So what's the process? Is that to me that seems like that's a sysadmin-y type of situation where we need someone who knows how to set up servers, get software installed, and then we just point the tests to that server, or how does that work?
Yeah, exactly. That's completely accurate.
Okay. Wow, that's amazing. I got that right. Any part of that.
Any performance test that you use for assertions, you can also pick as a test that you will be collecting data and sending to the dashboard.
Is that like a flag in the test or something?
It's really not. Like when you run the tests, you have an environment variable with the endpoint where the data should be sent to. And this is the only difference. Like if you run PHP unit without that environment variable, it will only run tests. If you add this environment variable, it will send the data. And then usually you could either just run a single test or you have a special group of tests, and then with PHP unit, you just run that group, and this is the group that is collecting data and sending it to a dashboard. And from there on, you need an open telemetry endpoint that receives the data, and then you can send it anywhere from there. But in the most standard way, you have a tempo for traces and Prometheus for metrics, which is then all displayed in Grafana. And you have to set up, as you said, it's more like a sysadmin kind of thing. You have to set up all these services to do what they're doing so that your graphs appear wherever you're hosting this. You can self-host it because these are all open source projects, which is, it is some cost, it is some work involved. Grafana also offers Grafana Cloud, which has a free tier. To be honest, we never really try to set it up, but I spent some time researching how it works, and I think that it should be the limitations that they have in terms of amount of data should be fine for most of our use cases, because Grafana is primarily meant to do instrumentation of your live servers, and there you usually collect quite a lot of data. And compared to that use case, we are collecting very little amount of data. So I don't think that any Drupal site or Drupal module would exceed the limits that they have. I think that the main downside is that the data retention that they have on free tier is just 15 days. And that there is no, as far as I understand it, there is no anonymous access. So like for the Grafana dashboard that we are hosting for Drupal core, it's you're perfectly able to access it anonymously. If you would be using Grafana Cloud free tier, I think that only the registered users that have the access would be able to see it. But that is, I guess, definitely okay for a custom website, and might be perfectly okay for a contributed module as well. And then another thing that is a little bit special is that for the metrics to be reliable long term, it's probably a really good idea to have a dedicated test runner so that you are running on the same hardware all the time. Because if you will be running your test on different machines, on different runs, then the metrics will vary just based on how powerful the machine that this specific run is being run on.
Well, the deterministic value should be the same.
Yeah.
But the non-deterministic will definitely change, right?
And in the dashboard are the non-deterministic that are the most valuable.
Yeah, that's a lot of the Core Web Vitals stuff, correct?
Yeah, and time to first byte and
right,
those things.
Fantastic. Well, this was great, Janez. I really appreciate your time. I encourage folks, if you have any interest in this stuff at all, go to, I have the URL right here, tag1consulting.com/Gander. All kinds of documentation and links. There's a great video from, was it a DrupalCon where this was introduced? I forget. There's a kind of a featured video there.
Yeah, we had a talk at DrupalCon Portland this year. And we also had, after DrupalCon, we had a webinar with Drupal Association, which is also recorded and available on YouTube. And
definitely, I mean, even if you're on the fence, check out I believe it's on the Drupal.org docs page, which again is linked from that same tag1consulting.com/Gander page. And just check out the code snippets. Because if you have any experience writing PHP unit tests, I guarantee you that any kind of fear or, fear is not the right word, but once you see the sample code, you're going to be like, oh, I know how to do that. That's pretty easy. So
yeah, I agree. And as I said, we're trying to make it as easy as possible.
Yeah, it really is. There's a lot around. There's a lot, we've talked for over half hour here, but really the core of this is just writing those tests. And it's not, when I saw those snippets, I'm like, oh, this is not that bad at all. So
yeah, it is. If you're used to writing tests, is a non-issue.
Exactly.
It should just come naturally.
All right, Janez, thank you very much for your time. And yeah, we'll let us know if there's any major updates to Gander in the future. And, we'll keep an eye on things.
Will do. Thank you for having me. And yeah, looking forward to talking to you in the future, hopefully.
Thank you for listening to the DrupalEasy podcast. Don't forget to check out all of our long-form Drupal training courses at DrupalEasy.com. And stay tuned for the next episode of the DrupalEasy podcast. See ya!